You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This speech gets picked up, and I've looked for it, and it's sort of hard to trace it in some ways. But I find several months later, the president of Yale University talking about give me liberty or give me death. Militias around the country start showing up in hunting shirts that have emblazoned across them, embroidered, give me liberty. And so this speech becomes sort of a rallying cry, not only in Virginia, but around the country. So Henry becomes, the term is used later, but the trumpet of the American Revolution.
Hello, and welcome to episode 407 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Patrick Henry is one of the most famous voices of the American Revolution. He was known even in his own time for his powerful speeches and his unwavering commitment to liberty. But did you know that later in his life, Patrick Henry opposed the United States Constitution? Did you know that during the political crisis of 1798-99, George Washington wrote to Patrick Henry and asked him to save the nation? In honor of the 250th anniversary of Patrick Henry's most famous speech, the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech, award-winning historian John Ragasta joins us to investigate the life and work of Patrick Henry. Now, during our investigation, John reveals information about Patrick Henry's early life and how he became involved with politics. What drove Patrick Henry to become a revolutionary and support the revolutionary cause? And why George Washington believed that Patrick Henry was the one man who could save the United States from itself during the political crisis of 1798-99. But first, come join us in the Ben Franklin's World listener community. The listener community is the place where you can submit questions for our guest historians, hear the latest news and updates about the podcast, and it's the place where you can hang out and chat about history with your fellow listeners. And the best part, it's free to join. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. All right, are you ready to commemorate the 250th anniversary of Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty speech? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is an award-winning historian and the former acting director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies in Monticello. He's also a lawyer and a beekeeper. He has taught history and law at the University of Virginia, George Washington University, and other colleges. And he's also the author of several books, including Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution, and, most recently, For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, John Ragasta.
Thank you, Liz. Pleasure to be here.
Now, in a funny historical twist, you're a scholar of Patrick Henry, but you have worked at the International Center for Thomas Jefferson Studies, home of one of Patrick Henry's early Republic political adversaries. So, John, I wonder if you could tell us about your interest in Patrick Henry and whether he and Thomas Jefferson were just always political enemies.
It's a very good question. No, they were not always political enemies. In fact, when Henry comes into politics, Jefferson is still a student at William and Mary. He's studying with George Wythe to become a lawyer, and he's enamored with Henry. He really thinks Henry is one of the greatest politicians of all time. He talks about Henry spoke as Homer wrote. It's extraordinary praise. They do become great political enemies, especially from Jefferson's side. Jefferson ends up really hating Patrick Henry. In terms of my interest, it is curious about their relationship because, as others have pointed out, Peter Onuf, for example, points this out, Henry and Jefferson are actually very politically similar in many respects. So it's interesting that they were personally very divided. My interest really came, and as the book starts, with the January 1799 letter when George Washington begs Patrick Henry to come out of retirement to save the country from a possible civil war. And I really came across that letter fortuitously. I was reading other things, and I read that letter, and I had finished my PhD in early American history. And I had no idea what it was about. And I thought, this is crazy. Why is Washington asking Henry to save the country? And that really launched my interest in Patrick Henry.
Well, I would like to talk about your new book, For the People, for the Country, because it does cover the crisis of 1798, which is really not a crisis in early American history that we often think about. But before we dive into this crisis and Patrick Henry's involvement with it, I wonder if we could discuss Patrick Henry and his life so that we have context for the role that Henry will play in this crisis. So, John, would you remind us who Patrick Henry was by giving us a quick overview of his life and accomplishments?
Henry's biographers oftentimes will talk about he was born poor. It was said he is the forest-born Demosthenes, the great Greek orator. In fact, he's middling gentry. His father was educated in Scotland, comes to America, marries a wealthy widow, not uncommon in the 18th century. Henry is given opportunities as a member of the gentry. He marries his childhood sweetheart. They're very young when they marry. He's 17. I think she's 16. His father-in-law gives him a plantation and enslaved people. But Henry fails, and he fails repeatedly. The plantation fails. He tries to set up a store. He's going to become a merchant. That fails. He sets up another store. That fails. And Henry is actually working in his father-in-law's tavern in Hanover County, and he notices the lawyers, and he says, well, maybe I could be a lawyer. And so Henry, later than most people, comes to the idea, I'm going to become a lawyer. He becomes a lawyer, and he's an extraordinary lawyer because he relates to people. People get Henry, or maybe more importantly, Henry gets people. And so talking to juries, he's extremely successful. And ultimately, his legal career launches his political career. And he becomes one of the great firebrands of the Revolution. Even though Jefferson dislikes Henry, he says Henry gets the ball of revolution rolling. And so he becomes this critical force to move the country towards revolution. And people are familiar with that because they are familiar with the give me liberty or give me death speech. But he then becomes the first governor of Virginia during the war, and he plays a critical role during the war, sending George Rogers Clark to the Northwest Territories, which is why Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois are now states. He plays a critical role in getting supplies to Valley Forge when Washington says the troops are starving. So he becomes this really very important political figure. But the only thing anybody ever remembers is those 7 words from St. John's, give me liberty or give me death.
How did Patrick Henry, who's now become a lawyer, he's moved on from the tavern, become a lawyer, how did he become involved with the American Revolution? Was there a moment that made Patrick Henry want to be a revolutionary? How did he get involved?
Well, it's a very good question. And yes, there is an incident, and it's the Stamp Act. And many people who talk about the Revolution start with the Stamp Act. It was Henry who really ignited that opposition. It looked like Americans were going to accept the Stamp Act. They didn't like it, but they didn't quite know what to do. And Henry had just entered politics. He had been in the House of Burgesses for less than 2 weeks, and he stands up and makes this speech against the Stamp Act. Caesar had his Brutus, basically warning King George, you could be assassinated for tyranny. And he introduces the 7 resolves against the Stamp Act. Now, what's curious is in Virginia, they only adopt 5 of those resolutions. And then they come back the next day and they scratch out the 5th. So only 4 of those resolutions are on the books in Virginia. But Henry, or some of his supporters who understand media already, they send all 7 of the resolutions out to various newspapers, and all of the resolutions get reported. And suddenly in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, people are saying, look, Virginia's standing up to the king. Virginia's standing up to the Stamp Act, and we need to join that. And so then he becomes sort of the voice of the revolution.
That's interesting, because Patrick Henry stands up against the Stamp Act in the Virginia House of Burgesses in May 1765. And if we think about the Stamp Act, most of us are likely to envision the Boston Stamp Act riots. And those riots didn't take place until August 1765. So the Bostonians, who are often credited with the big Stamp Act protests, they would have already had word that Virginia was taking a stand against the Stamp Act, and they would have heard about Patrick Henry in a speech several months before they actually acted against the Stamp Act.
And is appropriate on this show, Benjamin Franklin is in London as an American representative, and he says, I don't like the Stamp Act, but I guess we have to live with it because it's been passed by Parliament. And Franklin is actually talking about, well, this or that person should be appointed as Stamp Act collectors. So it looks like Americans are going to go along. They don't like it, but it's Henry's resolutions. And he has other people, by the way, who are supporting him, George Mason, Richard Bland, and others. But it's Henry's speech, that Caesar had his Brutus famous speech, that really ignites opposition. And as I said, this, dare I say, media manipulation, that all 7 of the resolutions are printed around the country, whereas only 4 are on the books in Virginia.
Now, in May 1765, Patrick Henry was just a first-year Burgess. So did his constituents elect him to the House of Burgesses knowing that he was going to be a revolutionary and he might take a stand on the revolutionary cause? Or did they elect him just because they liked him and thought he'd be a good representative?
It's a good question, but they don't really know the revolution's coming when they elect Henry. But they do understand that he is committed to American rights. What really brings Henry to the public's attention is the Parsons Cause, what's referred to as the Parsons Cause. It's a famous legal case. And the issue was in Virginia, there were many fees that were paid with tobacco. And one of the biggest one was the local minister, the Church of England. We have a state church in colonial Virginia. The minister is paid by taxes on tobacco. You have to pay the minister 16,000 pounds of tobacco. The problem with this is the minister's pay goes up or down depending upon the tobacco market. If tobacco prices are weak, the minister's not paid much. If tobacco prices go up, the minister gets a windfall. Tobacco prices had skyrocketed in 1763, and the legislature intervenes and adopts the so-called Two-Penny Act, saying you don't have to pay in tobacco. You can pay money to pay the minister. And in effect, this would cut the minister's salary by about half from what it would have been. And the minister sued. And the king, the Privy Council, had said that law is illegal. The law is very clear. You have to pay the minister 16,000 pounds of tobacco. And so the case was lost. The king had ruled the law was illegal, and nobody would take the case. Well, Patrick Henry took the case, and he makes this impassioned speech that says the king is a tyrant. And many historians point to this and say, look, Henry, even in 1763, is looking at the revolution. Well, that goes a bit too far. What Henry's saying, though, in 1763 is that the Virginia legislature adopted this law. That's the local legislature. They know the people. They know the province. Local elected officials have to control. And if the king and his Privy Council, 3,000 miles away, knowing nothing about Virginia, are going to interfere with this good law, then he's a tyrant. And so, to your question, yes, the people are aware that Henry is very, very committed to local control of the legislature, local control of democracy.
Scholars of the American Revolution have pointed out that there were many different causes of the revolution, and among those causes were the ideological reasons for the revolution. Quite famously, Bernard Bailyn called these causes the ideological origins of the revolution and pointed out that many founders were well-versed in classical texts and that it was these texts that helped founders come to their ideas about governance and local control. So, did classical texts also cause Patrick Henry to support local governance and come to his revolutionary ideas? Or did Henry have different experiences that first and foremost informed his views of the revolution?
Well, I think both is the simple answer. Jefferson spends years and years saying Henry couldn't read, he was illiterate, he didn't know anything. Clearly untrue. I mean, Henry, we know, read Latin, he read Greek, he read the classics. So he's very well educated for his time. He doesn't go to college. He doesn't have a formal education like Jefferson. Much like Washington, his education is informal. But your question's very interesting. I think, and I suggest in my book, that Henry's experience as a merchant, keeping a shop where people were coming in, the local communities coming in and buying salt and buying flour and buying things they need, and oftentimes doing so on credit and not able to repay the money, Henry becomes very attuned to the people. And that really becomes his political career then throughout time. He's known as somebody who speaks for the people. And I think it's that experience being a shop owner and talking with people that really influences him.
I'm smiling to myself as you answer because I know we're talking about Patrick Henry, but as you're talking, I can't help but think of Samuel Adams, who also had a similar streak of failed businesses and also had this talent for really connecting and speaking with people. And like Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams was also highly involved in the revolutionary cause.
I think that's right. And people sometimes compare Henry and Adams. And of course, they have interesting ongoing careers. They both have serious questions about the federal Constitution when it's proposed. Neither of them serves in the federal government. They're both the firebrands of the revolution. I think the comparison, though, breaks down a little bit that Henry actually holds a lot of very important political offices in Virginia, but he's much more of a political actor in some ways than Adams, who really is an agitator.
Well, to bring us back to Patrick Henry, would you tell us about Henry's ongoing role in the Virginia House of Burgesses as the Stamp Act crisis continued to play out and the revolution gains momentum? What was Henry's experience and contribution to the Virginia House of Burgesses during this revolutionary era?
In some sense, I said he's a firebrand. I sometimes tell people Henry was like the modern squad, the progressives who are coming in, the young bucks, and people like the Randolphs and the Carrs are very suspicious of this young guy who's coming in, talking about radical things, talking about challenging the king. And he's going to have difficulty throughout his political career with some of the older members who want to do things perhaps more moderately. And he's not the only one. It's Patrick Henry, it's George Mason, it's Richard Bland, it's Thomas Jefferson when he joins the House of Burgesses. As I said, Jefferson initially is a great admirer of Henry, but Henry is sort of the leader of these young, impatient, progressive politicians who then end up seizing power. And there's going to be a tension with the Rutledges. Edmund Pendleton has issues with Henry. The Randolphs have issues with Henry. Not necessarily because they disagree with what he wants to do, but he's in a hurry and he's angry and he's speaking in a forceful manner. So like I said, he's a little bit like the modern squad in the House of Burgesses.
Now, Patrick Henry's support for the revolution prompted the revolutionaries of Virginia to elect him to the first and second Virginia conventions in 1774 and 1775, respectively. John, what were the Virginia conventions, and what role did Patrick Henry play in them?
Well, he is elected to the conventions, and then he's elected to the Continental Congress. The convention is interesting because what happens is after the Boston Tea Party and British intolerable acts, the coercive acts in Britain where they're going to punish Boston, there's talk about creating a Continental Congress. And the royal governor in Virginia, John Murray, says, you can't do that. And he dissolves the legislature, says, go home, because he's afraid they're going to endorse the Continental Congress. Well, the legislatures just walk down the street to the Raleigh Tavern and they all meet, and it's all the same legislatures. And they say, well, we've been dissolved, so we're going to just elect our own people to the Continental Congress. And we're going to elect our own people to the convention. Now, the convention initially is not really a government. The government is still a royal government. You still have the House of Burgesses. But everybody knows the convention's the one that's actually running things. And so Henry's elected to the first convention in 74. He's elected to the Continental Congress in 74. He's elected to the second convention in 75. And it's actually at that second convention where he makes the liberty or death speech. Because the House of Burgesses technically still exists, but nobody goes. Nobody's paying any attention.
So the Virginia conventions were really the equivalent of the New York Provincial Congress or the Massachusetts Provincial Congress that other colonies were in the process of forming. And these congresses were basically extra-legal governing bodies in the colonies that were revolutionary leaning and revolutionary focused because the revolutionaries were in control of them.
Exactly. And in most of the provinces, but certainly in Virginia, it's all the same guys. It's the same people who are in the House of Burgesses. They just say, fine, we'll be the Virginia Convention.
Now, I'd like to go back to those 7 words that we remember Patrick Henry for, because 250 years ago, on March 23rd, 1775, Patrick Henry stood in the Second Virginia Convention in Richmond, and he gave a speech about military preparedness and ended his speech with the words, "Give me liberty or give me death." So, John, would you tell us more about Patrick Henry's iconic speech and why we remember it as well as we do?
Well, it's a great speech, of course, but one critical element that's very easy to forget is the date that you mentioned. This is 3 to 4 weeks before Lexington and Concord. Okay, so we don't have Lexington and Concord. Nobody knows about Lexington and Concord. Yet Henry is standing up saying, we've got to be prepared militarily. We've got to arm in Virginia because war is coming. And so he sees that the war is coming. He sees that the war is inevitable. And it, of course, is this wonderful speech. Now, in the 18th century, oratory, speech making was much more popular. They didn't have TV. They didn't have podcasts. They didn't have the internet. So these kinds of speeches were both informative, they were newsworthy, but they were also entertainment. And they were far more dramatic. We would see some of it probably as a little silly. But Henry makes this extremely dramatic speech, and he talks about why has Britain sent navies and armies to Massachusetts? They're obviously going to enforce their laws. They're going to make us slaves. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear or peace so sweet to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? And when he says that, he puts his hands together like he's chained, and he bends down like he was a slave. And forbid it, Almighty God. And he rises up and breaks his arms apart. And he takes a ivory letter opener. It looks a little bit like a knife. And he holds it way up in the air. And he says, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And he plunges the ivory letter opener and underneath his arms like he stabbed himself and sort of falls over. Again, we would see this as overly dramatic. People were spellbound. The place, and it's St. John's Church in Richmond, because as you pointed out, this is an unofficial meeting. It's not a government body. They're meeting in St. John's Church. People are stunned. They're just silent. And in a very difficult vote, it's not a unanimous vote by any means, Henry wins. Virginia is going to arm for the war that's inevitable. And this speech gets picked up, and I've looked for it, and it's sort of hard to trace it in some ways. But I find several months later, the president of Yale University talking about give me liberty or give me death. Militias around the country start showing up in hunting shirts that have emblazoned across them, embroidered, give me liberty. And so this speech becomes sort of a rallying cry, not only in Virginia, but around the country for we have no choice. The king and parliament are forcing us into arming and defending ourselves because they've sent armies and navies to enforce these unjust laws. So Henry becomes, the term is used later, but the trumpet of the American Revolution.
One of the facts that I found really fascinating in your book, For the People, for the Country, is that we tend to know a lot about Patrick Henry's speeches, but we don't have a lot of actual historical sources for them because it seems that Henry was quite the extemporaneous speaker and didn't methodically write them out like Thomas Jefferson would have written out his speeches so that he could read them in public. Would you tell us how we know what we know about this speech and others that Patrick Henry gave?
Well, the comparison with Jefferson's interesting. I tell people Jefferson, Washington, Adams, Franklin, Hamilton, they all were really worried about what you and I are going to think about them. And they preserve their papers and they preserve their letters and they write out their speeches. Henry doesn't seem to care. We have very few, relatively speaking, letters. He burns things. As you say, his speeches are extemporaneous. So many of them are not recorded for many, many years later. And some historians question them. They say, look, these speeches are made up by his later biographers, most importantly, William Wirt, whose biography comes out in 1815. William Wirt will later be the Attorney General. He's an important character in himself. I actually have spent some time with this, and I say, well, you know, we forget the 18th century is an oral world. They're used to hearing things and remembering things. They don't have Google. They don't have computers and laptops. They're not carrying a phone where they can send a text message. So their memory for things is extraordinary. And Henry is a very memorable speaker. Jefferson, who criticizes Henry and says, well, people could never remember what Henry says. But then the next day, Jefferson says, I remember like it was yesterday listening to Patrick Henry give that Caesar had his Brutus speech. And this happens over and over again. Edmund Randolph, all of these people say, I heard Henry and he's the greatest speaker of all time. And I remember it like it was yesterday. So those speeches that are recorded, we know they're not the full speeches. For example, Henry's final speech, which is very important, takes a central role in my book at Charlotte Courthouse. We know he spoke for over an hour. The speech that we have recorded can't be half of what he said in that hour. But I think that the speeches that we have recorded, they are accurate about the overall point, they're accurate about the outline, and they're accurate about the most famous lines. Give me liberty or give me death. Caesar had his Brutus. I will act in a constitutional way. These lines were very memorable to people. So, no, it's very unfortunate we do not have a lot of Henry's most famous speeches recorded carefully. But I think what we have accurately reflects why Henry was known as such a great orator.
You mentioned earlier that Patrick Henry never served in the national government created by the Constitution of 1787, but that he did serve in several important offices in Revolutionary and early Republic Virginia. Would you tell us about Patrick Henry's service to Virginia and why he never attempted to hold federal office?
Well, that's true. He never wants to hold federal office because he opposes the Constitution. He is not only a member of the House of Burgesses, but when they then elect people to the Continental Congress, it is George Washington first, Patrick Henry second. And we see that pattern over and over again. Patrick Henry is by far the second most popular politician in Virginia. He's far more popular than Jefferson. It's always George Washington, Patrick Henry at the First Continental Congress, at the Second Continental Congress. Henry leaves the Second Continental Congress to take on a job as colonel of one of the new Virginia regiments created after his liberty or death speech. That does not work out well. He's opposed by a lot of the old guard who's a little concerned about giving Patrick Henry military power. I think they're unfairly concerned. But he then leaves that position to become the first governor of the new Commonwealth of Virginia. And he's elected governor 6 times, which is unheard of. He serves 5 times. The 6th time he's elected, he says, no, I'm in retirement, I'm old, get someone else. But he's elected all of these positions. He's offered senator in Virginia after the Constitution is adopted. And he says, no, I don't want to be senator. So, as I said, in Virginia, which is the largest, the most populous, the most wealthy state, he is by far the second most popular politician. But he does not want a federal position. He's offered Supreme Court justice. He's offered Secretary of State. He's offered ambassador to France. He's offered ambassador to Spain. And he consistently refuses federal office. He had opposed the Constitution because he thought it was going to create a government too powerful, too distant from the people. And as I said a little earlier, Henry is really dedicated to local control of the polity, of politics. And he's concerned that this government will not respond to the people well. Once the Constitution is adopted, George Washington becomes president, and Henry reconciles himself to that. And he later says on a number of occasions, well, it's not behaving as badly as I thought. It's working a lot better than I thought it would. But he still says, I'm not going to serve. Now, part of that is also personal. Patrick Henry has 17 children, 2 wives, 17 children. And one of the things he's doing in the 1790s is he's trying to build up his wealth because he wants to give each one of his children a significant legacy. So another reason why he will not serve in the 1790s is he feels like he has private business to take care of. But that concern with the federal government being too powerful, that's an underlying issue as well.
What exactly did Patrick Henry fear about the new Constitution and how it allocated power?
Henry becomes the great anti-federalist. He's the leader of the anti-federalist movement in 1787 when the Constitution is up for ratification, 1788. And he is concerned that this new federal government is going to be too powerful, too distant from the people. And to put some explanation to that, Henry is a big believer in history. He says in that liberty or death speech, I have no way of judging of the future but by the past. So he looks to history. And there's some history to this idea of an American Congress, that during the First Continental Congress, Joseph Galloway, who becomes a great loyalist, makes a proposal to say, look, let's settle all of our differences with Britain. Let's create an American parliament, and each one of the colonies will send representatives to the American parliament, but they'll report to the king. And won't that be a great solution to all of these problems? And Henry is the only person recorded. There must have been others opposed, but Henry's speech is the only recorded opposition to Galloway. And Henry stands up and says, we can't do this. We know that the king bribes members of parliament by giving them positions, by giving them customs official or this tax collector or other position to make money. And he says, if we have an American parliament distant from the people, where's it going to be? It's going to be in Boston. It's going to be in Philadelphia. And only a small handful of people at that parliament, the king will bribe it. We need democracy, but it needs to be local democracy. It needs to be local control. And that's what he's really saying in 1788 when he opposes the Constitution. It's going to be too distant. I trust the state because I know who my state representative is. I mean, keep in mind at that time, if you were a landowner, a farmer in Virginia, you almost certainly knew who your state representative was. You may not know them well personally, but you knew who they were. You had seen them in town. You knew how to get a hold of them. You knew that they knew your community. And so one of Henry's complaints about the Constitution, he says, look, and I forget the exact number, but how many people were in the first House of Representatives? I think it was like 39, 40, something like that. Henry says, how can those few people represent millions of Americans? They won't know about us. They won't know about our communities. And I want to have a representative who knows he's from my county. He knows what it means to farm here. He knows what it means to try to be a blacksmith here. So it's that commitment. It's not that Henry is opposed to government. He's not an anarchist by any means, although modern anarchists love to quote Patrick Henry, which is really a misuse of Henry. He's saying that we need representatives who really understand us and understand our local problems. And so he's highly suspicious of the federal Constitution. Now, over time, he reconciles to it because he says, look, it's not really behaving as badly as I feared. They seem to be doing things generally correctly. They weren't being tyrants. But it's that concern that our representatives must really understand the people that drives Henry.
One of the big points you make in your book, For the People, for the Country, is that Patrick Henry did come around, as you say, to support the United States Constitution. How did Henry get there? And in what ways did Henry support the Constitution? Because, as we've already discussed, Henry was unwilling to serve in federal office. And that still seems like a form of protest against the Constitution.
Well, critically, you have to go back to when the Constitution was ratified by Virginia. There's an extraordinarily important incident that I don't think people focus on enough. The ratification of the Constitution in Virginia is a very close thing. Patrick Henry and George Mason are leading the Anti-Federalists. James Madison and Edmund Pendleton are leading the Federalists. And the vote is very close. It could have gone the other way. And if Virginia refuses to ratify the Constitution, the largest, wealthiest state, we would not have a Constitution. Henry, at the very end of that process, seems to gather that he's going to lose. The Constitution will be ratified. And he makes this extraordinary speech. And he says, look, I have tried. I have pointed out my concerns. I have fought the good fight. I will continue to oppose this, and I will continue to seek reform in a constitutional way. And that phrase becomes very critical. Because the night after Virginia ratifies the Constitution, George Mason calls a meeting in Richmond, basically trying to create a fifth column of Virginia effectively interfering with implementation of the Constitution. That we're going to continue to fight. We're going to do things that will prevent the Constitution from actually being ratified. And Henry is called into that meeting. Now, the historic record is a little bit ambiguous. I explain in my book why I come to the conclusion I do. But Henry basically stands up and says, go home, go home, give it fair play. We lost. The majority voted for the Constitution. And this then, I think, really explains a lot of Patrick Henry in the 1790s. Other historians have said Patrick Henry is a puzzle in the 1790s because of his actions vis-a-vis the Constitution. I don't think it's a puzzle at all. He says, we lost. We got outvoted. We've got to work within the system. I tell people, I don't know about you, the person I vote for doesn't always win the election. Well, in a democracy, what do you do when your side loses? And Henry's really modeling that for us. And so he continues to oppose a lot of things about the federal government throughout the 1790s. But he says, honestly, look, they're not being as bad as I thought. They're not really interfering with our rights the way I thought they would. He's very concerned about the hyper-partisanship, the Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. He says that's very wrong. He's very concerned about the criticism of George Washington, which becomes very partisan. He says George Washington is sort of the greatest man who's ever lived. Why are people so critical of Washington, even though he had been critical of the Constitution? And this was really, to some extent, why I wrote that book, that people remember Henry as this firebrand, give me liberty or give me death. And that is important to Henry. But his real career and his real passion was not, as I mentioned a moment ago, anarchism or I get to do whatever I want. It was, we have to have a functioning government where the people decide. And in a democracy, if they decide against me, like ratifying the Constitution, I have to go along, at least until the next election. And that's the way the system works. And I think that's really what explains what Henry is doing in the 1790s. He's never entirely happy with the Constitution, but he says this was the people's choice. And in that final speech, he says, if we can't live with the Constitution that we the people, adopted, the only option is monarchy.
Okay, we're ready for the crisis of 1798-99. John, at the start of our conversation, you mentioned that it was a letter from George Washington to Patrick Henry in January 1799 that drew you to this study of For the People, for the Country. We need to take a moment for our episode sponsor. Then we'd love for you to share with us the letter that George Washington wrote and what he wanted Patrick Henry to do. John, at the start of our conversation, you mentioned that it was a letter from George Washington to Patrick Henry in January 1799 that drew you to your study of Patrick Henry and For the People, for the Country. Please tell us about this letter and what George Washington asked Patrick Henry to do.
Well, it's an extraordinary letter. Washington writes, and he won't name names. He doesn't name names because he knows Henry will know what he's talking about. And he says, there's a crisis upon us. Everything dear and valuable to us is assailed. Measures are systematically and pertinaciously pursued, which must dissolve the Union or produce coercion. And by coercion, George Washington meant the U.S. Army marching on its own citizens. And so he begs Patrick Henry to come out of retirement. He says, only you can help us. Only you can stop this crisis and talk sense to these people. Now, the letter's curious for a couple of reasons. First of all, Washington and Henry had not communicated for many years. And here is George Washington saying, Patrick Henry is the one guy who can save the country. By the way, he's put up to that a little bit by John Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall, who tells Washington, you need to get Henry. The second curious thing about it is that, as I mentioned, he never mentions names. He doesn't say who's causing this crisis, but Henry knows. And the people causing the crisis are Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the radical states' rights agenda of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And that is the third curious thing about the letter. Patrick Henry was the leader of the Anti-Federalists. He's the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement. And yet Washington is writing Henry saying, you've got to defend the U.S. Constitution against this radical states' rights agenda of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And Henry, who's been offered Supreme Court Justice, offered Secretary of State, offered Ambassador, he says, finally, I will come out of retirement and do this because I think you're right. I think the nation is on the border of dissolution.
So we know that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were involved in working against the Constitution. But what exactly was the political crisis of 1798 and 99? What made this crisis so severe, John, that Patrick Henry has agreed to leave his retirement and run for the Virginia House of Delegates so that he can see the end of this crisis?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to go, but the Alien and Sedition Act is the critical thing. The Alien and Sedition Act adopted in 1798. In 1798, we have a Federalist president, John Adams, Federalist control of the Congress, the party of Alexander Hamilton. And the concern is we're going to get pulled into the European wars, the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte is rising in France. And there's real fear that we may face a Napoleonic army in America. We're actually in a quasi-war with France. People call it a quasi-war, but France seizes over 330 American merchant ships. People are getting shot at. People are getting killed. And so with the fear of war, the Federalists increase the military budget. They adopt the Alien Act, which gives the president the authority during wartime to throw people out of the country. But of biggest concern was the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act literally makes it illegal to criticize the Congress or the President of the United States. By the way, say whatever you want about the Vice President. Thomas Jefferson's the Vice President, because this was a period when the President and the Vice President were not necessarily of the same party. But the Sedition Act makes it illegal to criticize the government. Thomas Jefferson says this is a reign of witches. He writes to Madison and says, the country doesn't work, a republic doesn't work, a democracy doesn't work without a free press and without the ability to criticize the government. And Jefferson, by the way, is correct about that. Jefferson and Madison, there's a crisis because of the Sedition Act. History used to say that there were 14 indictments under the Sedition Act. More recent work has shown that there were more than 60 indictments involving more than 100 people. They were targeting newspaper editors. So they were throwing opposition newspaper editors in jail. This is a real crisis of democracy. Jefferson's right. But Jefferson and Madison, desperate about doing something about this because the Federalists control the Congress and the presidency, Jefferson drafts the Kentucky Resolutions. And the Kentucky Resolutions say that an individual state, if it believes the federal government is acting unconstitutionally, may nullify, that's Jefferson's term, a federal law. Madison writes the Virginia Resolutions, which are much weaker, but still suggest that you can interfere with federal authority. And critically, both the Kentucky and the Virginia Resolutions say that the United States is a mere compact of independent sovereign states. Now, the Confederation, under the Articles of Confederation, that was a compact of independent states. And you needed unanimity to amend the Confederation. No one had been calling the Constitution a compact since the Constitution was adopted. Jefferson really invents this idea. The implication was that any individual state could withdraw from the Union. And this is why this is the second crisis. This is why George Washington and Patrick Henry are looking at what Jefferson and Madison are doing and saying, you'll dissolve the Union. We're going to have civil war. And newspapers, I was astounded to find this. There are dozens of newspapers across the country, headlines, Civil War, talking about that Kentucky and Virginia resolutions are going to have state against state, state against the federal government. The Union's going to collapse. So that's the second crisis. And that's what causes Henry to come out of retirement to defend the Constitution that he had opposed and saying basically, look, Jefferson, Madison, you can't do that. Now, Governor Abbott of Texas has become fond of quoting Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions, talking about nullification, ignoring the history that those resolutions were, in fact, soundly defeated, roundly criticized, and even Jefferson and Madison really abandoned that kind of language and that kind of approach very quickly.
Of course, Governor Abbott isn't the only person in history to have picked up the idea of nullification. A lot of Southerners held up the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions before the Civil War to argue against tariffs. And in 1832, during the nullification crisis, President Andrew Jackson had to argue against the idea that individual states could nullify federal laws, an idea that his vice president, John C. Calhoun, supported.
Well, he's actually, I think, making the right decision because he says, look, the problem is the states. The problem is the Kentucky resolutions and the Virginia resolutions. It's these states going out of control. And there's two facts we haven't talked about. The first one is after Kentucky and Virginia issue these resolutions, they send them to all the other states and they say, join us in this opposition to the federal government nullifying federal laws. And 10 of the 16 states reject that emphatically. So you can't do that. It's not a compact of independent sovereign states. We're a nation. We have a constitution. You have to abide by the Constitution. So Henry's really on the right side of that. And he's saying we need to get to Virginia and Kentucky to stop this foolishness. The second thing, which I was shocked to see that people had not really focused on this letter, and Henry couldn't have known about this at the time. 8 days after the Virginia resolutions are adopted. Now pause for a moment. James Madison drafted the Virginia resolutions, every word. The Virginia resolutions are much weaker than the Kentucky resolutions. They don't talk about nullification. They talk about the states, plural, can interpose between the federal government and the people. So much weaker resolutions. 8 days after they're adopted, James Madison writes Thomas Jefferson saying, I think we went too far. And he says the Virginia General Assembly, in adopting these resolutions that he wrote, every word or his word, he says they went too far. We will be accused of usurping constitutional authority in the very act of objecting to the Sedition Act, which we view as unconstitutional, a violation of the free speech provisions of the First Amendment. And so, as I mentioned, Madison and Jefferson pull way back. They realized we're having enormous partisan battles in the 1790s. It's so serious. There's actually a Virginia militia officer quoted in the newspaper as saying, if France does invade, I will take my troops to the French banner rather than to the stars and stripes carried by a political opponent. This is treason. This is the kind of hyper-partisan language and activity that's going on. So Henry realizes it's the states causing the problem. And he says, I'll go to Richmond. And that's where we're going to stop this foolishness. Now, we know Henry dies 3 months later. He dies before he can take office. I argue, and I'm not the first person to argue, that had Henry lived, Thomas Jefferson would never have been elected president.
That's a bold claim, John. So why do you think if Patrick Henry had lived, someone else could have been our third president?
Well, the election between Jefferson and Adams was a lot closer than we tend to remember. Henry is extraordinarily popular. It's the 18th century. He would not have publicly trashed Thomas Jefferson. He would have endorsed John Adams. And he would have said, John Adams is a great patriot. John Adams deserves our vote. George Washington may have done the same thing. George Washington also dies in 1799. Now, there's, again, two facts that support that. The one is John Randolph of Roanoke, who's one of the great Jeffersonians of the early 19th century. He says, had Patrick Henry lived, Thomas Jefferson would not have been elected president. But the second fact that I point out in the book, and again, this is a letter that historians are aware of, but nobody talks about it. Benjamin Rush, that great gadfly of American Revolutionary era, Rush is sort of everywhere. He knows everyone. Benjamin Rush writes Thomas Jefferson almost immediately after his inauguration. And he says, you remember we were talking 2 years ago, and you told me that your election would be much quicker and much more certain if George Washington and Patrick Henry were not around. And in fact, they're both dead. And Jefferson, of course, doesn't respond to that. Jefferson's not stupid. He's not going to put something in writing saying, yeah, I was hoping to get Washington and Henry out of the way. But Rush says, yeah, you remember you told me that Washington and Henry are going to stand in the way of your political ascendancy. So again, we don't know. It's really related to manipulation of the Electoral College because they were really just figuring out how to manipulate the Electoral College. It's relatively new. And Virginia adopts a winner-take-all system in the 1799 House of Delegates, which is the House of Delegates where Henry would have been serving. And they adopt that. It's actually a close vote. John Randolph of Roanoke says Patrick Henry could have easily blocked that vote. Several of Virginia's electoral votes would have gone to John Adams. Henry also probably would have turned several electoral votes in North Carolina, several electoral votes in Kentucky, where he's very popular, toward John Adams. So, of course, we don't know, but I think it's more likely than not that had Henry lived, Thomas Jefferson does not win the election of 1800.
As I read your book, For the People, for the Country, I became really interested in the source of Patrick Henry's political power. Because even as you keep emphasizing in our conversation, Patrick Henry was very popular and a lot of people listened to him. So, John, where did Patrick Henry derive and earn his political power? How did he reach the stature where, he probably could have solved this national political crisis of 1798-99 while in Virginia if he had lived?
It's a great question, and political scientists could debate that. Why does any politician gain their political power? Henry seems to have this extraordinary ability of relating to people. And I mentioned, for example, his time trying to run a store. And he uses this. He's the most successful attorney in Virginia, especially in jury trials. He appeals to juries. I mean, I could tell you stories about Henry's appearance before juries, and he has them laughing. He has them in tears. He has them listening to every word. As I said, when he makes that liberty or death speech, when he stops, there's silence because people are so taken. It's almost, to use a modern analogy, it's almost Clinton-esque, like Bill Clinton. People thought of Bill Clinton as being, he's like the guy next door. You could have a beer with Bill Clinton. He's just a great guy to talk to. And Henry sort of has that ability. People respect Jefferson. People understand that Jefferson's brilliant. People understand that Washington is a critical character. But Washington and Jefferson are not backslapping guys. There's, in fact, a sort of a famous story where Gouverneur Morris goes in on a bet and gives George Washington a hug. And he wins the bet. And he says, I'll never do that again. George Washington is not a hugger. Patrick Henry is the kind of guy who comes to your backyard barbecue and everybody laughs at and everybody gathers around him. So he just seems to have this everyman appeal to people. Of all the revolutionaries, I'm now thinking about it, maybe Benjamin Franklin may be the closest analogy. I can't think of any other revolutionary who has that, like the guy next door you want to sit down and talk with, feeling about him. That's Henry.
Now, as you mentioned, just before he took office, Patrick Henry died on June 6, 1799. And many of us do remember Patrick Henry for those 7 words, give me liberty or give me death. But I wonder if you think that's what Patrick Henry's legacy is, those 7 famous words. So what is the legacy of Patrick Henry?
Well, I appreciate it because I think that's really the critical issue in some respects. Henry has been adopted by modern anti-government anarchists, Clive Bundy, people who oppose the federal government. Give me liberty or give me death. I shouldn't have to listen to anything the government says. That's clearly not Henry. The liberty or death speech he's making in the context that we have no representation in Parliament. And so we're going to have a revolution, not because we dislike the taxes, not because we disagree with the king, but because there's nothing we can do about it. Henry is a huge supporter of democracy, and that once you have elected representatives, you've got to go along with what they decide. And that's what he's saying about the Constitution in 1799. We, the people, adopted. I voted against it. I didn't vote for it, but we, the people, did. I therefore have to live with that Constitution. I have to behave in a constitutional way, Henry's phrase, to seek reform. It doesn't mean you have to be happy with the government's doing. It doesn't mean you have to agree with what the government's doing. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try to change what the government's doing. But you can't, for example, violently oppose a valid election. You have to work within the system. And so I think that that's really what Henry should be remembered for. And he's saying this in the 1790s in this hyper-partisan atmosphere. People are afraid of states trying to pull out of the Union. People are afraid of civil war. And Henry's saying that's not the way you do things in a democracy. You go to the ballot box. That's what you do in a democracy. And you accept the result.
We should move into the time warp. This is the segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. John, in your opinion, what might have happened if Patrick Henry had not had the family health or financial constraints that kept him in the state of Virginia? If Patrick Henry had been able to serve in national office, how do you think the development of the United States' early politics would have been different?
Well, of course, we're speculating with these kinds of alternative histories, and we don't know. Had he taken office, had he become Secretary of State under George Washington, and then imagine he would have been carried over under John Adams because Adams continues all of George Washington cabinet members. What might have happened is some calming of the partisanship, because if Henry had served, everybody knew he was the leading anti-federalist. And his serving in a Federalist administration, and we see this in modern times, Democrats want to have a Republican in their administration, Republicans want to have a Democrat in their administration. And Henry, with this mindset of a loyal opposition, I think would have spoken some calming influence and said, look, we need to be a little bit more moderate. We need to understand that sometimes the government acts in ways we disagree with. The solution is at the ballot box, not in the streets. So who knows, but it might have had some calming influence. Now, had he taken the position of Supreme Court Justice, which he was also offered, you might have seen a real battle, had Henry lived long enough, between a Henry approach and a John Marshall approach. But of course, we're speculation on speculation. The only reason John Marshall becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is because Patrick Henry gets him elected to the House of Representatives. If that had not happened, and Henry really comes out in favor of John Marshall and swings that election, John Marshall may not have been Chief Justice. But I think that in the Supreme Court, Henry would have had a more pro-state approach. So one of his famous legal cases involved the British debts that under the Treaty of Paris, all of the debts that were owed to the British merchants from before the Revolution had to be repaid. Henry had argued against that in Virginia and really opposed it. And it's not until after Henry retires that that case comes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court reverses the decision that Henry had won, saying that you don't have to repay your British debts. And that was really tied into state authority versus federal authority. So I think that had Henry become a member of the Supreme Court, we might have seen more of an embrace of state authority versus federal authority, perhaps.
John, now that you've published For the People, for the Country, what aspect of history are you working on now?
I've got several projects I'm looking into. Maybe your listeners can vote. I'm looking at doing a book on Jefferson's presidency. And of course, there have been many books on Jefferson's presidency, but I want to look at individual incidents in Jefferson's presidency that really reflect Jefferson's view of the presidency and of the world. So the Danbury Baptist letter, for example, a wall of separation between church and state. This is really Jefferson not only talking about religious freedom, he's also talking about the role of the president as a bully pulpit. So that's one topic, is President Jefferson. The other thing I'm looking at, which again, I think your listeners would like, is a book looking at conflicts between redcoats and patriots before Lexington and Concord. I'd probably call it almost Lexington. So there were a number of incidents where you have armed militia looking at armed redcoats, and a spark could have led to the revolution earlier. There's an incident in Salem, Massachusetts. There's an incident in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. There's an incident in Rhode Island. Williamsburg in Virginia, the powder incident, which Henry is very involved in, actually occurs after Lexington and Concord, but nobody knew that because they don't have an internet, they don't have phones. It's 2 days after Lexington and Concord, but nobody is aware of Lexington and Concord in Virginia. So that's the other possibility, is looking at some of these incidents. That would be a much more popular public history book.
Well, I'm casting my vote for the Powder Incidents book because I would really like someone to talk about the powder raid at Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in December 1774, because that was something that I learned about in 8th grade or high school. But few have ever heard of this powder incident unless you grew up in New Hampshire. So I'm casting my vote for that project.
It's great because I've started the introduction and it's Paul Revere. For gosh sakes, it's Paul Revere riding through the night to say the British are coming in December of 1774. It's a wonderful incident. You get 400 armed militiamen against 6 redcoats, and the war could have started in Portsmouth, but it doesn't.
John, if we have more questions about Patrick Henry or the crisis of 1798-99, where's the best place for us to reach you so we can pose them?
First of all, you've been kind enough to mention my most recent book several times, For the People, for the Country. And as I said, I really think has a different view of Henry and of Jefferson than has previously been given. I also have a fairly interesting article that just came out in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography about the Jefferson-Henry relationship. I wanted to call that article, Why Does Thomas Jefferson Hate Patrick Henry? And people said, you can't say that Thomas Jefferson hates Patrick Henry. And I said, but he did. We changed the title. But in terms of reaching me, and I'm always interested in doing podcasts, doing an opportunity to speak, I now do have a website. I'll urge people to look at the website, johnaragasta.com, and love an opportunity to talk with people about this history and the founding and the Constitution, religious freedom, which is a topic I've spent a lot of time on, and always enjoy chatting with people.
John Ragasta, thank you for introducing us to Patrick Henry and for telling us more about the significant contributions he made to American politics.
Thank you, Liz. It's been a pleasure.
We often remember Patrick Henry as the fiery revolutionary who declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." But as John Ragasta has shown us, Patrick Henry's political legacy extended far beyond the 1775 speech or his fight for independence. During his final years, the former revolutionary and 5-time governor of Virginia found himself in a different fight. This time, he needed to preserve the Union that he had helped to create. The political crisis of 1798-99 was a turning point in early American politics. The crisis revealed deep divisions over states' rights, federal authority, and national identity. So this once staunch anti-federalist, Patrick Henry, found himself advocating for national unity as political factions used these issues to try and tear the young nation apart. Patrick Henry's decision to answer George Washington's call to return to public service speaks volumes about Henry's evolving political philosophy and his commitment to the nation, using the idea of a constitutional way. As John told us, the constitutional way is a mode of behavior. It's a way to support the Union even when you disagree with its leadership. By acting in a constitutional way, men like Henry, and you and me in our own time, speak up for what we believe in. We call our senators and representatives, we run for office, we vote in elections, and we participate in our local governments, such as getting involved with our local school and planning boards. Patrick Henry understood that he could still shape the future of his young nation and preserve it, even after he had lost the battle against the Constitution. In the end, Patrick Henry recognized that the Constitution isn't itself the ultimate authority over the government. Instead, it's we the people. The Constitution exists to serve and reflect the will of an engaged and active citizenry. By embracing this constitutional way, Patrick Henry demonstrated that lasting change comes not through division, but through participation, debate, and commitment to the greater good. This is what drove Patrick Henry to heed George Washington's call to leave retirement and to save the nation. Look for more information about John, his book, For the People, for the Country, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/407. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Remember, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues, Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, the political times in which we live are no less tumultuous than the time in which Patrick Henry lived. So how do you think we can best uphold Patrick Henry's idea about preserving a constitutional way in our present day? Let me know what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.